Section 2.7 is changes in ecosystems, specifically ecological succession. This is going to be our last topic for this unit. So we'll talk about ecological succession first, and then indicator and keystone species, which are helpful to understanding the health of different ecosystems and habitats. Succession describes natural and gradual changes in species that live in a habitat. We're going to talk about primary and secondary succession. Ultimately, succession describes a gradual replacement of one plant community by another. Primary succession begins in a place with no soil. So these are sides of volcanoes where new rock has been created, landslides where superficial surfaces have slid out of place and exposing bare rock. Flooding has a way of scouring surfaces and leaving only bare rock. An important part of primary succession, I would say a necessary part of primary succession, is the arrival of pioneer species, typically through the air. Often we'll see lichens, because lichens do not need soil to survive. They can attach to rock and survive very well there. Some good candidates for primary succession, right? Nice bare rock here, next to some water, no less. Right, this volcano that has erupted, spewing gas, probably has some bare rock. So if you are a candidate for primary succession, are you liking the lichens? So how does primary succession work? Lichens start to break down the rock that they're attached to, and then weather and erosion also breaks down rock. The lichens die and they decompose because there are bacteria out there. Of course, the bacteria are not breaking down the rock, but they're breaking down the lichens, adding that organic matter to the rock that's there. If enough time passes, then that will start to become soil. The new soil can host simple plants, mosses, which are not lichens, they're a little more complex. And then some ferns. Ferns are nice, relatively simple plants that can grow in a lot of different places. But then as these organisms die, they are broken down by decomposers, and they also contribute to the soil. As enough time passes, the soil layer thickens. More complex plants grow in that soil. They do their thing, they die, they're decomposed, and they begin to add their nutrients to the soil as well. If you take long enough, right, tens or maybe hundreds of years, shrubs and trees can survive in this environment. Once there are flowers and shrubs and trees, then animals can move in. Insects, birds, mammals, and now a variety of life is supported where there used to be nothing. Secondary succession describes a place that already has soil. So there's different pioneer species that occur in these situations, and secondary succession usually occurs faster than primary succession. An important example of this is after forest fires, where many species are killed, or I should say many organisms are killed. They might decompose or be weathered, but then new species can move in, and they grow faster because there are already nutrients in the soil and also nutrients provided by the organisms that were killed by the forest fire. A diagram that's pretty commonly shown for primary succession is this one that shows early pioneer species on the left, and then on the right, more mature system. On the very far right is what we would call a climax community for a temperate deciduous forest. We're going to come back to that term, climax community. This is not a healthy ecosystem, of course. You can see that the trees are not in good shape here. So to put some years on this, annual weeds in a secondary succession situation will grow within a year, and then perennial weeds will grow within 2 to 4 years. Eventually, you'll get pine seedlings, maybe a young pine forest, and then after 150 years, you get a mature hardwood forest. As you can see, this is one of the issues with cutting down old wood forests, old growth forests, is that it takes 150 years to get a mature forest, and we've been cutting down trees a lot faster than that. You're going to see lots of different versions of succession diagrams if you were to look at them on Google. Right, I showed you the one before. There's this one. There's another one that goes, right to left and shows, these different plants that exist at different times. Going back to the vocabulary of climax community, this is the stable group of plants and animals that's at the end of the succession. In certain places, this means big trees, but not everywhere, right? You're not going to get big trees in a desert. So for a desert, this is a desert climax community, and it looks very different than, say, a climax community for a tropical rainforest or a chaparral. The temperature and precipitation means different species once it's reached maturity. So a thing you should be able to do is look at a diagram and describe whether it's primary or secondary succession. So pause the video for a moment. Which one is this? This would be a primary succession because it begins with bare rock. Secondary succession would have soil. Let's talk about a couple of categories of species that exist to tell you the health of an ecosystem at any point, right? Not just during succession, but maybe during a climax community. So one group of species we're going to call indicator species. These are species that indicate damage or danger to habitat or an ecosystem. Often we see amphibians as indicator species because they live both in water and air. Butterflies are fairly fragile, and so if butterflies are in trouble, then you can consider the environment to be in trouble. Talk about amphibians specifically. Right, I was saying that they live in air and water, and so they're susceptible to both air and water pollutants. They suffer from habitat loss, right, either through destruction of the habitat or pollution of the habitat. Prolonged droughts will dry up their breeding pools, which are necessary for eggs and reproduction. And then again, the pollution. So if the pollution doesn't destroy the habitat, then amphibians tend to absorb pollutants directly through their skin. Finally, UV radiation can also harm amphibians. And if those weren't enough, flatworms are bad for amphibians. Some places frogs are delicacies and they're overhunted. And then finally, if they get invasive species in their habitat, they can't compete. The other category we're going to be concerned about are keystone species. And these are species that, if removed, habitats would have a real hard time surviving. Typical keystone species include pollinators. Often apex predators are keystone species, although not always. And of course, not all keystone species are apex predators. Some decomposers are considered keystone species. And so wait, why is this arch here? So it has a keystone at the top. And we live close enough to Pennsylvania that they are called the Keystone State, where they have the keystone as their symbol. So specifically what happens when keystone species are removed, food webs are disrupted, right? We talked about how the food webs can fall apart if a species is removed. Nutrient cycles can be disrupted, right? If you talk about decomposers needing to get nutrients back into soil, If you lose those decomposers, then you lose that part of the nutrient cycle. Um, we'll see population crashes, although you could have the flip side of a predator being removed, then their prey population will explode, which causes its own problems. And then, of course, extinctions if you remove the wrong species. So consider some keystone species. Sea otter likes to feed on sea urchins, but if you remove the otters, the urchins would take over, and that would deplete the kelp, right, which can't compete against the sea urchins. Ultimately, the kelp is the producer, and so if the sea urchins take over, then the kelp is not producing, and there's not enough food in the ecosystem for other organisms. So it's important for the sea otters to keep the sea urchins in check. American alligator is considered a keystone species. Their tails are good at making burrows, which provides habitats, and they're also a top predator. So they will control prey populations. Beavers are probably one of my favorite keystone species. They build dams, which of course are something for them, but then also make habitats for other species. And the fun thing about some beaver dams, they're large enough that you can see them from space. So if you look up the largest beaver dam in the world on Atlas Obscura, you will find the largest beaver dam in the world. Another keystone species is the red mangrove, right? We talked about mangrove swamps. There's an entire biome that depends on mangroves. Their roots are really good at keeping soil in place, and because their roots basically create a little forest underwater, small animals and reef fish, or small animals including reef fish, can find shelter there and also reproduce there. I talked about pollinators, right? If the bees aren't there, then certain flowers aren't able to reproduce because there's nothing to carry the pollen from flower to flower. So these are some good examples if you need one in your pocket for a keystone species. That's it for section 2.7. Let me know if you have any questions.